Alright, episode 58. Let's get rocking and rolling. Today we're talking about the Galapagos giant tortoise, and what am I even supposed to say? Everyone and their mother knows about this tortoise. It's the largest tortoise species in the world, blah blah blah. But let's just get in, shall we? And maybe I can actually teach you a little something. So, before I get started, let me discuss what I'm doing here at the exhibit. I have decided that I was actually going to make this mostly water. Now, if you know anything about tortoises, they aren't great swimmers. Unlike turtles, they are completely terrestrial, so gotta keep it as shallow as physically possible. But the reason I did it is because I actually wanted to recreate the few islands of the Galapagos that you can find the giant tortoise. Now, those islands that I decided to draw upon for this exhibit consist of Isla Isabela, the large one we are making, with the two smaller ones being Isla Santiago and Isla Santa Cruz, with a little bit of a notice, with being pretty much just stones, of being Isla Rábida and Isla Pinzón. Now, as I work on that, let's talk about the animal in question, shall we? Scientifically, the Galapagos giant tortoise is known as Chelanoidus Niger. I'm going with Niger. And that essentially means tortoise-like and then the word black. Now, yes, it is a tortoise, but the reason it has the term tortoise-like is because while it is a tortoise, it is not directly related to other tortoises of the old world, especially some of the other large species that they originally thought were similar. It's a little confusing, seeing how, yes, it's a tortoise, but it's also not scientifically related to the original animals we call tortoises. I know, it's stupid, but that's how it is. Interestingly enough, though, most people may not be aware, but there are 13 extant subspecies and 2 extinct species. Now, the main difference between them has to do with the islands they're on and whereabouts on the islands. And some may have multiple subspecies. For instance, only 7 of the 127 islands of the Galapagos archipelago have giant tortoises. So, 15, 7 islands. Some of them are doubling up. But that's beside the point. The main way you can tell some of them apart has to do with color and their shell style. Some of them having what is known as a saddleback shell, and others being dome-like. But for the most part, they're all Galapagos giant tortoises. Now, the name Galapagos is kind of funny because the archipelago of Galapagos is known as such because of the tortoises. So, the archipelago is literally named Giant Tortoise Island. So, it's literally giant tortoise. For the first time not being the scientific name. Now, while many of you, like myself, was a little confused because tortuga is the word that I associate with tortoise, in Ecuadorian Spanish, and probably some other ones, Galapagos is a synonym for tortoise. Now, the giant tortoise is literally a giant. It is the largest of all fully terrestrial reptiles and obviously the largest tortoise species on Earth, weighing a whopping, roughly, 919 pounds. That is almost half a ton. And the oldest that they have become was 177 years old. The lifespan is kind of what causes them to become so large. There is more to it, but reptiles don't stop growing as they get older. Now, granted, the oldest was not the heaviest, most likely, but it definitely was on the heavier side. So, let's get into the history, and it'll sort of explain why they're so large. The Galápagos Islands first started forming roughly 5 million years ago. They are a volcanic island chain just like Hawaii. Now, the closest living relative is the Chaco tortoise that lives on the mainland of Ecuador. However, saying that they are the closest living relative is kind of misleading because they aren't directly related at all. They branched off roughly 12 to 25 million years ago, so there's no actual living relative that would be considered closely related to the Galapagos tortoise. But they were pretty much thought to have been around about as long as the islands themselves. Now, the first two islands that they probably ended up on were the island of Española and San Cristobal. Now, you may be wondering, if it's a tortoise, and as I said earlier, not good swimmers, how'd they make it out to a volcanic island? Well, that's actually quite simple. Most likely, they floated there, as the species that they're most closely related to, and most likely looked more alike at the time, was smaller and less of a living tank that they are now. They most likely ended up got washed out by currents and ended up being pushed by the Humboldt current that goes south to north across the South American continent and pretty much dispersed them on the two islands I spoke of earlier. Now, this is just a theory, but it's the best we got, seeing how, like we said, they can't swim that well, but the extended necks and being somewhat buoyant probably would have led them to get to the island on their own. Now, the reason they've become so large is something known as island gigantism. There is an island dwarfism, but that usually applies to larger animals. Since this was already a small animal, it became massive. With no natural predators, nothing stopped them from just being bigger and stronger. Now, don't get me wrong. When they're still young, there's plenty of animals like birds, reptiles, and whatnot that definitely would eat them. But once they started getting into the couple 100 pounds, nothing could kill them. So they just kept growing bigger and bigger and bigger. Now, the species was first discovered along when the islands were discovered by Fray Tomás de Belanga, who, interestingly enough, was the 4th Bishop of Panama and had actually accidentally washed up on the Galapagos Island after the winds died down while he was sailing back to Peru to settle a dispute between Francisco Pizarro and Diego de Almagro over the division of territory after conquering the Incan Empire. In 1535, the Galapagos Islands are famous for being observed and studied by Charles Darwin in the 1830s. However, he was not the one to give the name to the Galapagos tortoise, nor really be influenced by them specifically, as we may all remember from, our biology or natural history classes. The finches were what really pushed his understanding of evolution. However, the tortoises did have their little bit of influence. As stated, he did notice that they were all essentially the same except for a few minor differences based on where they lived and which island they occupied. Now, as with every other animal, there are issues with their lives, and most of them, all of them, have to do with us, human interaction. For you see, despite their massive size, the deliciousness of tortoise meat was not on their side. There was thought to have been over 250,000 tortoises when they were first discovered. But due to overhunting and invasive species like rats and cats killing their eggs and their young, it cut them down to 3,060 by the year 1974. And as we've discussed, species had gone extinct due to that. As a matter of fact, it was so bad that one species, or one subspecies, went extinct in 2012. And this was the Abingdon Island tortoise. Now, all the current surviving subspecies of giant tortoise are now at best vulnerable, and some are even critically endangered. This has caused a pretty much poster child effect of the Galápagos giant tortoise, where it is seen as a symbol of the conservation movement. And while some have succeeded in being repopulated and having a better chance at regaining population, there's still plenty of things that are causing dangerous drops in their population to this day. And with all that said and done, that's all the information I have for you. I didn't want to stick along the lines of the most obvious things there are. I mean, this is a species that pretty much everyone knows about and everyone has heard about 1,001 times, but it's still on the list and I had to do it. But with all that said and done, if there's anything you would like to add to the conversation, please let me know in the comments. And I would love to know more, and hopefully the next episode, the Gemsbuck, will be a bit more interesting because I actually really like this animal for reasons I can't explain. And with all that said and done, thank you for watching. Do all the, whatevers. Go outside, touch grass, hug your loved ones, drink water, and bye-bye.